There's a specific kind of curiosity that never really goes away when you've dealt with a narcissist. And it's this. What are they actually like when nobody's watching? When there's no audience to perform for, no target to manipulate, no admirer to charm, when the mask has nowhere to go and no one to go on for. You've seen the version of them built for public consumption. You've seen the version built specifically for you, whether that version was charming or cruel or somewhere in between. But the version that exists in complete privacy, the one with the door closed and the phone off and absolutely nobody around to perform for, that version tells you more about who they actually are than almost anything else you'll ever witness. And today, we're going there. Here's what makes this question so genuinely fascinating and honestly a little unsettling once you understand it fully. Most people assume that when we're alone, we're simply more ourselves, more relaxed, more unguarded, closer to some authentic core identity that gets slightly obscured in social situations. But for a narcissist, solitude doesn't work that way at all, because the entire architecture of a narcissistic identity is built around external reflection. Their sense of self isn't generated from the inside and then presented outward. It's constructed, moment to moment, from the outside in, pieced together from how others perceive them, react to them, admire or fear or need them. Which raises an uncomfortable question that most people never think to ask. If a narcissist's identity depends this heavily on external input, what actually happens to that identity when the external input disappears completely? What's left in the room when there's no one left to reflect them back to themselves? So let's walk through 5 things that consistently happen when a narcissist is truly alone, because this pattern reveals something that the public-facing performance, no matter how convincing, can never fully hide. The first thing that happens, and it's one of the most quietly devastating parts of this entire picture, is a kind of internal flatness, an emptiness that has nothing to fill it once the performance stops. Because here's what a lot of people don't realize about narcissistic identity. The confidence, the charisma, the commanding presence, all of it requires an audience to actually function, the same way a play requires spectators to actually be a play rather than just an empty stage with actors reciting lines to nobody. When the audience disappears entirely, when there's genuinely no one left to perform for, not even in anticipation of a future interaction, something close to a vacuum tends to open up. Not necessarily dramatic despair, though it can look like that in more severe cases, but often something quieter and in some ways more revealing, a kind of restless emptiness, an inability to simply exist in stillness the way people with a more internally generated sense of self are able to. This is why so many narcissists struggle profoundly with genuine solitude, why silence and stillness, rather than feeling peaceful, tend to feel almost unbearable, because silence offers nothing to reflect them back to themselves, and without that reflection, there's a real question about what, if anything, remains. The second thing that happens is compulsive self-narration, an internal, sometimes even external, ongoing commentary where the narcissist essentially becomes their own audience in the absence of a real one. This might look like replaying conversations obsessively, not to reflect on them honestly, but to refine and rehearse better comebacks, better justifications, better versions of themselves for next time. It might look like mentally rehearsing future interactions, crafting the persona they'll present, anticipating how to control the narrative before it even happens. Some narcissists do this out loud, muttering responses to arguments that already happened, or arguments that haven't happened yet, but that they're already preparing for. This constant internal narration serves an important function because it allows the narcissist to maintain a version of the external audience, even in its complete absence, essentially performing for an imagined observer when no real one is present. Because the alternative, sitting with genuine, unnarrated silence, is far too uncomfortable to tolerate for long. The third thing that happens, and this one is particularly revealing, is the collapse of consistency. Because here's something crucial to understand about the mask a narcissist wears in public or in relationships. Maintaining that mask requires effort, active, ongoing effort, monitoring how they're coming across, adjusting in real time, keeping the performance coherent and appealing. When that effort is no longer required, when there's no one around to monitor or adjust for, the careful consistency of the public persona tends to fall away, sometimes replaced by something far more petty, far more insecure, or far more mundane than the image they work so hard to project when others are watching. This is where you sometimes hear stories from people who've briefly glimpsed a narcissist in a moment they didn't realize they were being observed, a moment of genuine irritability over something trivial, a flash of insecurity that contradicts the confident persona entirely, or simply a kind of bored, checked-out blankness that looks nothing like the vibrant, magnetic personality on display in social settings. The mask isn't fake exactly, in the sense that it does represent something the narcissist genuinely wants to be true about themselves. But it is effortful, and effort, by definition, cannot be sustained without a reason to sustain it, and privacy removes that reason entirely. The fourth thing that happens is a specific kind of rumination, one that centers almost entirely on image management rather than genuine self-reflection. You might assume that alone time would be an opportunity for real introspection, examining choices, considering impact on others, genuinely wrestling with mistakes. But for most narcissists, the internal rumination that happens in solitude rarely goes in that direction. Instead, it tends to circle back again and again to questions of perception and control. Did that comment make me look weak? Does that person still respect me? How do I make sure nobody finds out about that mistake? How do I get ahead of this situation before it damages how I'm seen? This isn't reflection in any meaningful, growth-oriented sense. It's strategic maintenance, an ongoing, exhausting effort to protect and manage an image, even when there's no one immediately present to manage it for, because the anticipated future audience is always, in some sense, already in the room. And the fifth thing, the one that ties all of this together and reveals something particularly important about the entire structure we've just walked through, is where things get genuinely revealing, because it explains not just what a narcissist does in solitude, but why solitude itself represents something so threatening to the entire system holding their identity together in the first place. That's exactly where we're going next. The fifth thing, the one that finally ties everything together, is what I'd call ontological dependency, a fancy way of describing something surprisingly simple once you strip away the jargon. The narcissist's sense of actually existing as a coherent, valuable self is not self-generated. It's borrowed, continuously, from the presence and reactions of other people. And this is why solitude isn't just uncomfortable for a narcissist, the way it might be mildly uncomfortable for anyone who prefers company. It's existentially threatening, because without an audience, there's a real, unsettling question about whether the self they've built is even fully there at all. Think about what this actually means in practice. For most people, identity persists whether or not anyone else is around to witness it. You know who you are in an empty room the same way you know who you are in a crowded one, maybe with slightly different energy, but the core sense of self doesn't flicker in and out of existence depending on whether someone's watching. For a narcissist, that continuity doesn't hold the same way, because the self was never built on an internal foundation strong enough to stand alone. It was built, brick by brick, out of external reflection, admiration, attention, reaction. Remove the bricks, and what's left isn't a smaller version of the same structure. It's something closer to an absence, a felt sense of not quite being real, not quite being anyone, until the next interaction restores the illusion of solid ground. This is why the first four things we walked through, the internal flatness, the compulsive self-narration, the collapse of consistency, the image-obsessed rumination, aren't actually four separate, unrelated behaviors. They're four different strategies for managing the exact same underlying terror, the terror of what happens when there's no one left to confirm you exist in the way you need to exist. The flatness is what creeps in when none of those strategies are working yet. The self-narration is an attempt to simulate an audience internally. The collapse of consistency happens because maintaining the performance for no one serves no protective function anymore. And the rumination is simply damage control for a self that never developed the internal architecture to feel secure without it. Now, here's where I want to slow down and address something that a lot of people find genuinely surprising once they understand this dynamic fully, because it reframes something that seems, on the surface, deeply contradictory. If solitude is this uncomfortable, this destabilizing for a narcissist, why do so many of them still seek out isolation sometimes? Why do some narcissists seem to prefer being alone over being around people who might see through them? The answer lies in a distinction that's easy to miss at first glance. There's a real difference between solitude and controlled retreat. Genuine solitude, the kind we've been describing, unstructured, unplanned, with no anticipated future audience, is the version that produces the discomfort we've walked through today. But controlled retreat, stepping away deliberately on their own terms, often specifically to create anticipation, to seem mysterious, to punish someone with sudden absence, or to regroup and prepare a stronger performance for the next round, isn't actually solitude in the psychological sense at all. It's still fundamentally relational, still oriented entirely around an audience, just one that's temporarily off stage rather than genuinely absent from the narcissist's mind. That distinction matters enormously because it explains why a narcissist might disappear for days and seem completely fine, even smug, about the absence, while true, unplanned, unstructured aloneness, the kind that offers no future payoff and no imagined observer, tends to produce exactly the discomfort we've spent this whole episode unpacking. I think it's worth pausing here to address something important for anyone listening who has spent real time around a narcissist, because understanding this pattern often brings up a specific, complicated emotional response, something close to pity, mixed with confusion about whether that pity is even appropriate to feel. And I want to be honest with you about this, because it's a nuanced thing to hold. Understanding that a narcissist's identity is this fragile, this dependent on external validation, this genuinely unstable in true solitude, does not erase the harm they've caused. It doesn't make the manipulation less real, the devaluation less painful, the discard less devastating. Compassion for the underlying wound that likely created this pattern in the first place, and accountability for the damage that pattern causes to everyone around it, are not mutually exclusive. You're allowed to understand where this comes from and still refuse to keep absorbing the cost of it in your own life. In fact, understanding it clearly is often what finally makes it possible to stop absorbing that cost, because sympathy stops functioning as an excuse to stay and starts functioning as simply a more accurate, less confusing way to understand behavior that used to feel completely senseless. There's one more layer worth naming here, because it's the piece that tends to land the hardest for people who've spent years trying to understand someone like this. If a narcissist's sense of self is this dependent on external reflection, it means, in a very real sense, that you were never actually dealing with a fully separate, autonomous person in the way you understood that concept to work. You were dealing with something closer to a role, a performance sustained by whatever audience happened to be available at the time. And when you were that audience, you weren't just loved or valued or targeted as yourself specifically. You were, in some sense, being used as scaffolding, as one of the external structures holding up an identity that had no stable foundation of its own. That's not an easy thing to sit with, but it's also, once it's fully absorbed, one of the most liberating realizations available to anyone trying to make sense of a relationship with a narcissist. Because it means the coldness, the inconsistency, the disappearing acts, none of it was ever really a verdict on your worth. It was simply what happens when scaffolding gets removed from a structure that was never actually solid to begin with. If this gave you a new way of understanding something that's confused you for a long time, know that you're far from alone in trying to make sense of it, and there's a lot more we can dig into together going forward. Make sure you're subscribed because we go deeper into this every single week.